At Coburn Place, our vision is to illuminate a path forward for survivors to restore hope and promote healing. We offer transitional housing and community-based housing for around 105 to 120 families at any given time. And the reason that we're able to do that is because we have a community of supporters, donors, volunteers, funders, people that believe and invest in survivors every single day. And we truly exist because of that community. And I am really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. And I'm really excited about the speaker that we have. So I want to introduce you to Danyette Smith. She is the first director of Indy Champions, which is a domestic violence organization out of the city of Indianapolis, which was created in 2022. So I'm going to read her bio because it's incredible. And then I'm going to hand it over to her, and she's going to talk to us about what domestic violence looks like locally in Indianapolis. I think that this conversation is really going to be a space for us to look at what our city, county, zip codes are up against every day. A lot of times domestic violence can be this like very broad, almost national statistic issue. But I think one thing we all know is that this is something that is happening next door. This is happening right here. And Danyette is going to give us a real deep dive insight into that. And after Danyette is done presenting, we are going to have plenty of time for a Q&A with her. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat while her presentation is going on, and know that we'll be able to get to those at the end. So Danyette Smith is the director of Indy Champions for domestic violence prevention. This is funded through the Office of Public Health and Safety and an initiative of the Indy Public Safety Foundation. Indy Champions is an incredibly important and innovative program. It's a liaison between survivors and community resources. Danyette is also the founder and president of Silent No More, a domestic violence awareness and prevention organization. She served as the director of strategic initiatives for the Domestic Violence Network, and Danyette is also a Coburn Place board member. Danyette, can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey and your connection with domestic violence?
Definitely. So thank you for having me first. Definitely honored to be here. Hello to all the faces and the names that I know and love. So what got me on this journey has been a victim of domestic violence. I went through domestic violence for 10 years, and it really started off the first 2 years as great. But there were red flags that I would not have known were red flags until I got the education for domestic violence. The abuse started after I had my daughter. And when I had my daughter, the first blow was to my eye. And when it came, it was unexpected. There was no physical fight or anything before that, but it ultimately fractured my eye socket, which I currently have plates in there to hold my eye socket together for my cornea. And then ultimately it continued with the domestic violence, physical to the mental to the financial, but it went to gun violence towards the end. So in 2008, we were in the midst of an argument. He put the gun to my head and told me that he would kill me if I left, in addition to putting the gun to his head and stating that he would kill himself. I knew at that moment, so it wasn't my eye being fractured, it wasn't the mental abuse, it wasn't any other abuse, but at that moment, I knew that if a person said that they would kill themselves, it is a chance that they will kill you first. So that was kind of my flag of, okay, this is a dangerous situation. Again, there was no education on domestic violence before this. But then I looked up to the heavens and was like, when I get out of this, I'm gonna be who I need, because I need somebody. The people around me just don't understand what I'm going through. They want me to leave, but I don't even know what I'm going through. So from 2008 to 12, that's when I started to become a CASA and started to learn what domestic violence was. In addition to that, I was taking my bachelor's degree and it was for human service, child and family welfare. And in the midst is when I learned the dynamics of abuse. So the cycle of abuse. And the only thing that was missing out of that book was me and my children's names. From there is when I changed my mind frame. So from 2012 to 2014 is when I really started getting the education on what domestic violence was, the trainings from the Domestic Violence Network, and pretty much any free trainings that our city or our state had to offer, looking up who the service providers were, and understanding who the shelters were. But it wasn't until February 6th of 2014, while I was at work, I was not texting back quick enough. And the last text that I read was, "I'm coming to kill you." At that moment, I truly thought it was just going to be another day of arguments when I get home. I know it's a possibility of physical abuse, but I just thought it was just going to be another one of those days, until his white car pulled up to my job and he popped the trunk and got the shotgun out. At that moment, I froze, but then I knew I had to go into flight immediately. So I ran and locked our front door because it's glass doors, so you could see the car. But he knew that there was a side entrance to my job. So that's when he started to head to that side entrance. I grabbed the cordless phone, ran and I hid and I called 911. Before that, 911 was not a thing, just because I was in fear of calling the police. But then once I called the police and IMPD got there, I believe it was South District, they gave me that little card, and told me to go downtown and file a protection order. I went downtown and filed a protection order in so much fear, mind and emotions everywhere, that I did not file that protection order. I left. But thankfully, the Julian Center was partnered with IMPD some type of way. And they an advocate contacted me and said, "Hey, come here, we'll help you with that protection order." They helped me. They got me a pro bono lawyer to go to court with me, and really supported me at that time. And I was not in the shelter, but they supported me and gave me a sense of understanding and security. And from there, I knew I could not turn back. I knew that I had to continue each day the new success story. And Pat, literally every day that I woke up February the 6th, I had to pat myself on the back and say, "You can do this job. It's a new day. And this is the moment." If there, I just continued the education. And I won't be quick, but the importance was, when I got out of it, I knew that me and my children were physically free from it to an extent, because we had the protection order, but I knew mentally we weren't free. So for the first 2 years of getting out, I focused on just me and my children. And then I started to ask them questions like, what do you know about domestic violence? What do you know about teen dating abuse? Without giving them my story. So they didn't know the full story of why we transitioned. We lost the car, we lost the house, we lost the home, moved back home with my mother, got a storage, but more so of what did they know about domestic violence and teen dating abuse? And they didn't know nothing. So my ultimate goal was to educate my children on it before I gave them the full dynamics of what mom has been through, just to not raise bitter young ladies, because they were daughters. And for them to know that today I can be around my child's father and I don't see my abuser. I see him as my child's father. And that was just the power of forgiveness, and knowing that if I didn't forgive him, I couldn't be who I was today. It wasn't to forgive him for him, but it was more so to release, and part of my healing journey when I was in that process of healing. But that's kind of where I am today. It's been an amazing journey, definitely some ups and downs on it, but I wouldn't change it for the world. Each day that I come in, it's not a job at all. It's literally helping somebody and being who I needed.
Danyette, oh my gosh. That is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that, and for starting off this conversation with such courageous, just like sharing, and your journey is incredible. I think the thing that stands out to me when I hear your story each time is, I wanted to be the person I needed. I want to be the person that I needed. And I think that is uh, just inspirational, but I think it also speaks to the compassion and the eager heart you have for being a helper to others. And you are that person. And so I think that that is a really great kind of segue into your work now and what you're seeing that survivors need in Indianapolis.
Thank you. So of course, as she stated, I am the director of the Indy Champions. We started this program back in January of 2022, in which we had staff in May. The program literally started with a blank piece of paper and me really trying to sit down and see how can I not duplicate the services that are out here, but ultimately fill the gaps where there are gaps within the system or within the domestic violence agencies and service providers around Marion County and Indianapolis. And who we are, basically a streamline for Indy's domestic violence resources. Our program is literally trying to prevent the possibility of re-traumatizing the victims while spreading that prevention and awareness resources into the neighborhoods. We are a survivor-led program, so all of our advocates, including myself, are survivors of domestic violence, and it ultimately helps with working with victims of domestic violence. And it's not to tap into who we were back then, but more so to be able to get in their shoes. And it brings so much of a sense of comfort to those that we have worked with when they know that who they're speaking to understands because they've been through it. We have 4 connectors, and we've added some pictures on here as well, but our 4 connectors and is mainly that victims and survivor standpoint. So in the middle, that picture, I don't know if you can see my little pointer, I apologize, I'm just moving it around, but that middle picture, okay, is a survivor of domestic violence. She was born and raised here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we were able to, work with her through our programs. And now she is an awesome individual, doing her thing. But when we work with victims and survivors, our main goal is to be able to streamline them to where they need to go. So instead of like programs giving individuals a sheet of paper or 7 numbers to call, we want to be able to allow them to give us a call and say, okay, based on the information that you have gave us, this is what's available to you. In the instances, and at one point our program was able to, give the Julian Center a call and know, or not, and get a bed count to know before we send them there. With their restrictions and knowing that the Julian Center is a high lethality, before we send them there, know that there is something available so they don't have to go through that intake process as well. We'll call the other domestic violence shelters in reference to the Salvation Army and just say, hey, do you have any beds available before we send someone there? Just so that way we can prevent them from doing that intake. But then in addition to the second was the 3rd number on here, but meeting with those domestic violence service providers. So if we meet with them monthly, just to try to fill that gap, we can't fill a gap that we don't know is there. So really trying to meet with them, get the understanding of where the gaps are, what are the gaps. Some of them we may not be able to fill because it's above us. But however, meeting with them monthly, listening to, what they're going through, and then trying to get an understanding of what we can do, in addition to making sure they understand what we can offer as well. And then when it comes to first responders, and then there's a picture at the top where we have some of the service providers when we did a media in reference to kicking off October. But when it comes to our first responders, really getting in front of IMPD. So we were able to go to their roll call, let them know who we are and what we're here to do, but then also get an understanding of the trainings that are being being put in front of our first, our beat officers, which is our street officers, being able to sit in their trainings, know what they're teaching their beat officers, and then seeing how, and if there is a gap from what the community is saying based on what they're training their beat officers. And that has been a great success with that, in addition to meeting with the detectives and building that great relationship with the detectives, the prosecutors. I pray every day to, one day somebody will drop, a judge contact on my lap so that way we can get connected to the judge. But I know that's one of the gaps that is in our domestic violence system, is really getting in front of the judges And then we were just able to meet with the U.S. Attorney General, and then ultimately the community, getting that prevention and awareness out to the community to know what resources are available to them, to make sure that they understand, what resources are available to them and how to get in contact with those resources. And if there's any questions, Julie, as I go, like, don't hesitate. I don't know if you're going to save them all to the end or if you're going to kind of do it in between, however you want to flow, that's fine. And then with masking the abuse, I know, one of those questions was in reference to how has it changed since the pandemic hit. And we got some of this information from the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've seen them all here. Thanks for your awesome reports. March of 2022, we know Indiana had declared a public emergency for us. And though Indiana was another challenge that was already existing with the trauma and the crisis for the victims of domestic violence. So we've seen a high increase in 2022 or in 2020 in regards to domestic violence. Everybody was stuck in their homes. The kiddos weren't going to school, and the world was pretty much standing still. However, the abuse continued to rise, and it really continued to highlight something that was already a problem, but it really amplified when COVID-19 had came. So I know there was an increase of 181% in domestic violence related homicides. And I know they pulled, it was due to the unemployment, the underemployment, isolation, alcohol consumption, and greater access to the firearms. And then the 911 centers reported up to an 87% increase. So it was not only to the 911, but we can also imagine DCS. And even though the kiddos weren't going in school, DCS probably decreased because they couldn't report it. However, most likely it increased from those 911 calls with the children present in the home while domestic violence did occur. And then, of course, the IMPD data, which is, Indianapolis. So what we do is, with our partnership with IMPD, we're able to get the data by quarters and then for the entire year. And we knew in 2001, there were 32,942 calls to 911 in regards to domestic violence. And then last year in 2022, it was 31,821 calls for domestic violence. And then I was able to get the numbers from the prosecutor's office in regards to from January of 2022 to current, there were 3,257 cases open. So imagine you have 31,821, but the prosecutor's office only seen 3,257 of those cases. And then only 1,437 of those cases are currently open. So there is a huge gap in relations to those who are calling 911 and need those services to who are really, being presented to be prosecuted, and really just trying to get the understanding of how can we change that narrative or what needs to be changed in regards to, more prosecutions coming when it comes to domestic violence. Are you about to say something? Yes.
Do you have, when you see a number like this, almost 33,000 in 2021 and close to 32,000 in 2022, when you look at that, it feels staggering to see that amount. What, in your experience of doing work with survivors, knowing that there is a huge proportion of survivors that don't call 911, when you see this, what's your sense of how this reflects the true kind of picture? Do you see it and you think, this is half of the domestic violence that is occurring, or that this is an actual snapshot, or like what's your kind of sense of what this looks like for people that are here, but they don't have a sense of like, what do I take away from seeing numbers like this?
Well, we definitely know that it's not all of them, because everyone does not call 911. Unfortunately, some of these could be neighbors calling, some of these could be gas stations that are calling because they see the abuse. So we have to understand that even though this number says 32,000, we can almost guarantee that it's way more abuse and calls that should have took place to 911. And there are a lot of victims that are suffering, in silence is what we say. Of those numbers, we do know that most of those zip codes that we got these numbers from are in poverty-stricken areas where they're underserved, where the Black and Browns are 100%, with 46218 being one. And if you're familiar with 46218, that's the east side of Indianapolis, Indiana. And just alone, they had 2,000 calls last year just in their 46218 zip code. So that can tell a lot in reference to the imbalance of the resources or the lack of resources that are in that area, but also the stigma that applies to those of brown, that they stick onto. We don't call 911 or we don't call the police. The police is against us. So there's so many things, the embarrassment, the fear of the children being taken. So there are a lot of calls that definitely are not reported on here. And then as you can see that statement at the bottom of the screen, it says of the women who called the police to the scene of domestic violence situations, 1 in 3 felt less safe. So if you call one time and you don't feel safe after you call, they 9 times out of 10 won't call back until it's extreme and it's more dangerous, or it's a life and death situation that can ultimately lead to fatality. Now, when it comes to our IMPD partnerships, because I always try to tell the community and trying to bridge that gap of understanding that no domestic violence agency can do this work without IMPD. It's impossible. Like, we can't go to a scene and remove a person. We can't get in the middle of it. It's super dangerous. It's dangerous for IMPD just to go to a domestic violence scene. We know that's one of the most dangerous calls that IMPD gets, but then also to be just victim advocates or just programs, we know that it's even more unsafe for us to go. So that partnerships with domestic violence is super important. And some of the partnerships that we do is that Operation Domestic Disruption. So they focus on those serious violent felons with domestic violence convictions and warrants. And how that works is that while they are focusing on the victim, the serious violent felons, the Indy Champions are focusing on the victims. So we're able to sue as they arrest this individual, because majority of these individuals have the warrants. We're able to automatically be connected to those victims who are connected to that individual felon. And then from there, try to get them in the service programs and the service providers that are needed. So that way they can get that advocacy and then get the things that they need within that emotional state of time, because we know that the first few hours of a domestic violence incident, and I would say the first 24 majority of the time, don't quote me, is super important because they're in an emotional high. So everything that they're saying is true and accurate because they're in that high. It's when that high has gone down that they're starting to think, they're starting to let that guiltiness that most survivors feel start to play and have an effect on them. And then they can start to change their story. They can start to change the things that they want to do. So trying to connect with them, as quick as possible is one of the things. And then we have the coordinated community response, which identifies victims who have had 3 or more IMPD calls within the same month. And with those individuals, we coordinate with service providers in Indianapolis that may have already serviced them to see how can we, what did work, and then how can we as the Indy Champions come in, fill that gap, and then reconnect them and hopefully start to take away those IMPD calls and ultimately get them into a safer situation and out of that abusive situation.
So IMPD gives you, does this happen monthly that they give you the 3 people who have had 3 or more calls?
So it's more than 3 people, but yes, they identify the victims, the relationships that have had 3 or more calls to that home or to those particular people. So it may not even be.
Indy Champions does its own reach out to them to try to do wraparound support.
Correct. And get them to the service providers that they need. And we have had some great success in that. from, individuals who did not want to work with IMPD, did not want to, go to court, to ultimately being able to talk to them and just get to their level and them being able to connect, because again, we're survivors. We're transparent. We don't mind saying we understand and giving just a little bit of our story, because then it opens their mind of like, okay, I do have a chance. So there is a possibility in this. And then we were able to get, those protection orders, and then they actually show up to protection order court to get it finalized, and then move forward, in the process of them having a safer life. The kiddos are safer, that safety plan, that ultimately that education, because we can do as much work as we can with these survivors of domestic violence, but if we're not educating them on the cycle of the domestic violence, they can leave the individual that was abusing them, but then they can reconnect with another individual who's abusive because they can't identify those flags. They don't understand the dynamics of the cycle when it comes to domestic violence. So one person asked me, what does success look like to you when it comes to working with victims of domestic violence? And of course, I'm like, we want to get them into safety and get them secure. But ultimately, a success story is knowing that this individual is a survivor of domestic violence, was able to get out of the domestic violence and move into their own self-sufficiency, their own living safer, but ultimately the education. They understand the dynamics of domestic violence. They understand the cycle of domestic violence and how that honeymoon plays a part. Mentally, they have grew from the level that they were in to the level of understanding domestic violence. If we can get them to understand that, we have an awesome chance of them not going into another domestic violence situation. We know that mental health plays a huge part in that. So if there is some mental health issues within that individual, then of course therapy, and even just assuring them that therapy is okay, and getting them to understand that you're not alone in this. It's okay to get therapy. It's okay to get, like, trying to make the things that are not okay in these zip codes and in these areas where domestic violence is high, that it is okay, is like one of those goals. And then our referrals. Whether it's referrals for protection orders from our detectives and protection order assistance in court, to that advocacy and so much more. But to IMPD, when it comes to those victims, they are there first majority of the time on the scene. And if we can get an advocate there in real time, and when I say real time, I don't mean on the scene, in a dangerous situation, but right after it happens, and get them connected and start working with them, then we have a better chance of trying to reduce these zip code numbers and just domestic violence in general when it comes to Indianapolis. Some of the barriers, and I know there's so many more that we can talk about when it comes to domestic violence and keeping a victim in the relationship or returning back to the relationship, is we know shelters. We know that we don't have many shelters here in Indianapolis at all. And majority of them are staying full. We have one that's a high lethality. So if it's not high lethality shelter, then they can't go there. And then the other shelters, they're full all the time. So we're experiencing where a lot of the victims, they do have to stay in these domestic violence relationships, or they are staying in their cars with their children, or trying to just figure life out without any shelter. We know housing is another one of the issues that we are facing here in the city of Indianapolis, between, the landlords, to, the lack of the access to the evictions, to all the things that could happen within a domestic violence relationship. So when you do get out, then you're at a barrier when it comes to trying to regain that safer living with that housing again, and what could be done. We know the Indiana Coalition does an amazing job. Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence does an amazing job, and has, helped a lot of survivors when it comes to trying to get those evictions removed, so that way they can start fresh and can move forward. We know the mental health services. Domestic violence and staying in it can be a mental thing. We know that there's physical things as well, but that mental, and making sure they understand the dynamics of domestic violence. There's advocates available. There's therapy services available. How long is that waiting list? And do they have to wait 6 months before they can get in when they're in the moment now? Those things can be a huge burden when it comes to the barriers of domestic violence and the system related to domestic violence. Like we said, from the, the protection orders and the systems and how they do it to the judges. Again, if anybody is connected to an awesome judge, it would be a little plug there. And please connect me to them. We have some awesome people that would love to connect and just sit down with them. We're not trying to persuade them over here or over there. We're just more so wanting to let them know what we're seeing and how can we fill the gap when it comes to the system related to domestic violence, because we're at a standpoint when it comes to the judges. They're like untouchable. So if we can do anything to just connect with the judge, that would be amazing to get in front of them. That's kind of where the barrier sits for us. Of course, guns in the homes. We were talking about the guns and knowing that in domestic violence incident, it increases the chance of homicide by 500%. So we're not saying 50%, we're not saying 20% or even 75, but 500%. And with the laws changing here in Indianapolis, we know that guns are everywhere. I mean, you see them way more, especially in the communities with the high zip codes. You're seeing them at every gas station, at every corner. You're seeing them sitting on the porch, walking down the street. They're just easy to see now, that it is definitely become a concern. And even with the Indy Champions, we're seeing so many more younger victims coming in to need services, and it's attached to a gun being involved. And I always tell people, because you can be 18 with a gun now. So any individual that's abusive, that's 18 with a gun, they're attached to someone in a relationship. They're in a relationship, which means that 9 times out of 10, that gun is being used on that individual, and that individual is in fear. But we know that studies show, the Domestic Violence Network said in 2020, show that in 2018 and 19, Central Indiana has 65% of all homicides related to domestic violence were committed using a firearm. And the numbers of 2022 was showing an increase to 73%. But then in 2020, if you see at the bottom, in 2020, 33 of the 41 domestic violence related deaths involved a firearm. So of course, the other weapons that could be used, or it could have been strangulation, or it could have been, a knife or anything, but 33 of those were used from a firearm. So firearms it's just honestly becoming bad in our city. It has definitely become a headache. It has a lot of people in fear, and we notice that majority of the times when a firearm is involved, you can ultimately take out, family members as well. So understanding that instead of calling a father, or instead of calling a brother to come over to pull up to help you move out, you should really be calling 911, just because it could risk the chance of your family members or your loved ones being killed if there is a gun in the home as well. So trying to educate in regards to the dynamics of the gun laws, the guns in the home and how they play an effect. But then also, when the children growing up without the parents just because of that gun. Here's some more numbers, data numbers. So in 2021, we've seen that there were 5,987 filings for protection orders. And then in 2022, there were 4,915. And then it showed that 50% of those protection orders petitioners were unrepresented. And when we say that, that means that they didn't have any advocate, they didn't have anyone to assist them with that, which ultimately could mean a protection order was not approved. And if a protection order is not approved, that could leave a victim with no hope. That could feel like the system has failed them without understanding if it was a checkbox that was missed, if there was something that was not there. So we really try to empower the community, empower victims to contact the advocate, So that way they can, protection orders are done online now. So it's not an inconvenience that you have to go to the CJC or the city county building to do a protection order, but you literally can do those protection orders online and walk through the protection order with them. So that way it can get done. And then trying to educate the community in reference to understanding a protection order and a no contact order are two different things. And a no contact order is out of the control of the community, out of the control of a victim, but more so in the control of the system. And then understanding that once a no contact order or a decision has been granted, criminal case, that no contact order could be dropped and you're no longer protected. So with these filings, though we had 31,821 calls last year for domestic violence. 4,000 filed a protection order. So again, there's a gap. Maybe it was just an argument, because it doesn't mean that it was automatically prosecuted, but trying to understand the reasoning. Or, some people just think of protection orders as a piece of paper and that they don't work. But when you connect with the advocate, that protection order could work for your good, more so than against you. And then let's see, we got time for questions. So the resources with the 4 connectors, it allows us to connect you with the resources needed related to intimate partner violence. So from the shelters, transitional housing, the advocacy and referrals trainings, we do trainings to the community as well. We actually will be doing family nurse practitioners, all the Indiana region, the southern region, central region, we'll be able to train every single nurse there in reference to domestic violence. And then we'll do Marion County nurses right after that with the DV 102. So we're super excited to really get that prevention and education, because we'd be surprised, and I tell people all the time, domestic violence it does not discriminate. We can get a call from a prosecutor who's going through domestic violence, a DCS worker, a lawyer, a homeless person, our judge who's going through domestic violence. So it does not discriminate no matter what your profession is. You'd be surprised at the ones who are equipped with domestic violence, but when it comes to their own situation, they can apply the tools. It's understandable. And we just want to make sure that they understand that there are advocates out here, there are programs out here that can assist them, when it comes to domestic violence. So I am super transparent, everybody. Any question that you want to ask, please throw it my way. If I don't know it, I'll let you know, hey, I don't know that, but I can get back with you on that. And then I know we got some other experts on here as well. So
I think that I'd like to hop off or start us off with one of the striking things to me outside of these extremely high IMPD crisis calls is that Indiana has a higher rate of domestic violence than what we see nationally. And I wonder, Danyette, if you could weigh in on why you think that is, what you think it is about Indiana or Indianapolis that is making domestic violence a more claustrophobic issue than elsewhere.
So there of course can be many reasons related to that. For the reason for me, I can say that from my opinion, domestic violence resources really just started to get highlighted during COVID. Before that, you just didn't hear the word domestic violence too much. The community didn't connect with the word domestic violence too much. So it just occurred. The programs, the resources and the services, like I know that there's been a little more money poured into them as well, but before that it wasn't. But again, there could be so many answers related to that when it comes to the high numbers. Of course, mental health plays a huge part in it, and people not identifying with the mental health struggle that they have, or even, thinking that it's a thing because it's been a generational thing that's in their life. So they don't even try to tap into it to get the help. So the cycle just continues generation after generation. that would be some of it that I would add in there, but I know there's so many other reasons, from economic and the jobs to the deserts in areas. I mean, majority of these zip codes that we have for Indianapolis are in food deserts. So, you know, there's so many economic things that can relate to that as well. So, you know, I would touch the economics, the jobs, the money, you know, the resources in those areas, but then ultimately that mental health, the mental health of those in our Indianapolis area.
Yeah, that's really striking to me. At Coburn Place, we work with survivors that are at that intersection of being unhoused because of experiencing domestic violence and also experiencing poverty at the same time. And the way that those three things kind of work together to make it almost impossible to escape seems to be the food desert. Like all of those different factors seem like they layer on to maybe not create, you know, some kind of like greenhouse where domestic violence just runs rampant, but is more about access to building stability that it seems to be the factor there.
Yeah.
We have a question from Noni. Hi, Noni.
Yeah.
Why do you have a problem getting in front of judges? Like what would you identify as the barriers to getting judges specifically to be part of this conversation?
Just from my standpoint, they've just been untouchable. They just don't want to have the conversation. They don't have to have the conversation at all. They have their requirements and what they have to do. I can say, you know, since the court has dispersed, and when I say the judges, it's because there is no one judge or there is no one courtroom for domestic violence. So you can have domestic violence court in a court over here today, but then it's going to be with a totally different judge tomorrow and then a different judge the next day. So there are so many judges that are not just doing domestic violence, and nothing against the judges, but there's so many judges that are not only doing domestic violence. And if we can get more so of a system where we have judges that are laser focused on domestic violence, they understand the dynamics of domestic violence and understanding that when a victim is sitting in front of you and telling their story just to get protection, knowing that they are fearful and they're crying in front of you, but yet you are just digging into them as if they are not the victim. Like, those send red flags to the advocates that are sitting in the courtroom of saying, you know, there has to be some training, there has to be something available to them. I mean, there's judges that are going in there and they're sending individuals to certain locations online to say you can see your protection order, when we as advocates sitting in there, we know for a fact that they cannot access their protection order from there. So there is a disconnect of education when it comes to domestic violence in our judges. And if we can just sit in front of them and see how can we, for the betterment of our community, our victims, and to bridge that gap of them even being scared to even work with the system and you know, before the system, be for the system, not two words, not one, then it has to start from the top. It has to start with, you know, them being able to know and see that those at the top, the judges, do understand the dynamics of domestic violence, and they'll be safe, you know, if they go in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's so succinctly put. That I think that we see this with housing as well, that people who are experiencing homelessness because of domestic violence are often categorized broadly with everybody that is experiencing homelessness, when domestic violence has really different indicators, factors, and, you know, a path out of it. And I think thinking about a specialized housing point for survivors, thinking about special court systems for survivors, I think that is a Coburn conversation that we should have next month. Danyette, are you free to keep
Look, I
chatting
am
about it?
free. You got me. No, but seriously, I mean, even with there are no advocates in the courtrooms, or there are no
Yeah.
advocates in the CJC, period. So they have nobody to talk to, nobody that understands. It's just horrible for our
Yeah.
victims right now. And hopefully we can, get in front of somebody and I pray on it, that we can get in front of somebody that'll just listen, and try to bring that change that will ultimately help change our community and the victims and survivors we serve.
So one thing that I think is really interesting about your work and Indy Champions positioning is that you are doing prevention work and disruption and interruption of cycles, but you also are a key referral to services for survivors that are experiencing domestic violence and are looking to stabilize and create a fresh start. And that kind of like being a nerve center of community collaborations, I think makes your perspective on community collaborations really significant. And so I'm wondering, like, from your point of view, why are community collaborations important in supporting survivors? Why does it matter?
I think it matters tremendous because I always say, and I say it in the directors meeting, that there's not one agency that can do this work alone. Like there's not one program that could do this work alone. Like we have to be in this together. And it's not about, who's leading what program or how. It's more so about doing this together with the focus on, the victims and the survivors that we serve. How can we come in together, trust each other as we collaborate, with these agencies and with the community and say, okay, we see that there's a gap here. How can we fill that gap? The Indy Champions can't fill it all at all. We're not that, $34 million agency or anything like that. But if I can just come in and bring us together and say, okay, community collaboration is important. We need not only the domestic violence agencies, but for instance, we, trained all the Gene Glick housing apartments, where the low income housing apartments. We understand that a lot of our victims and survivors live in these apartments. How can we get domestic violence agency education to the management, because they risk losing their homes? So for them to open the door and say, yes, train all of our employees, it gives the victims and the survivors that are living there a sense of knowing that they can trust going to their leasing agency and saying, hey, this is what I'm going through, without being put out, because they understand the dynamics of domestic violence. So being able to partner and being able to collaborate with agencies and organizations and businesses within the community just brings more of a stronger bridge in the gaps that we're trying, to fill. And we need them. I truly believe relationships are priceless. Genuinely believe relationships are priceless. It's way more, expensive than money. So, building those relationships and having those relationships genuinely, knowing it's for the benefit of the survivors and the victims, is the ultimate goal. And that comes with community collaboration. And again, no domestic violence agency can do this without those connections. For instance, like the Coburn place, or, because that's the housing piece of it, or, like the Fireflies, and that's the therapy and the counseling, or like Beacon of Hope, and that's the dogs and being able to foster the dogs. Like everybody has their own piece and has their own excellence that involves, bringing it all together, and to be able to try to amplify that as much as we can, like is the ultimate goal of just bringing it together to collaborate, and we be one powerful force, more so than just kind of, in our own zones, doing our own work, trying to, run our own money. It's just more so, how can we be powerful together? And that's that community collaboration that I see and that I hope for within our city every single day.
Yeah. Leanne has a question. So she's asking about, we've seen a lot of cuts and a lot of turmoil with public criminal justice dollars. Specifically, DVPT was like the last kind of horizon shout out to ICDV in the room. They advocated for us fiercely across the state. But as these cuts happen, how do you see that affecting programs throughout the community? You know, kind of in your position of seeing both at Indy Champions, but then all of these collaborators that you have, how do you see those cuts affecting programs?
So any cut when it comes to budgeting and when it comes to money, it affects, not only the program, but it affects those that they serve. And then ultimately, it goes back important to our community, where there's a budget cut with advocates, and that means it's less people that have an extra voice, that have that extra support that can push them, which ultimately is going to leave them in the domestic violence situation, which is ultimately going to end up either with a generational thing or, the chance of death within, a home, because those cuts are coming. The domestic violence world, there's not even enough money, for these programs at all. There's programs that need those self-sufficiency dollars, so that way they can help those individuals and not have to, go through other sources to try to get it, which is prolonging this individual to being in a safer environment for them or their kiddos, to just even, the needs within the organization. I mean, all human service programs need that funding because they're serving the humans. And what end up happening with budget cut is that they lose people, then the people that are there get burnt out and go somewhere else. And then ultimately it just is a ripple effect for, again, those that are being served, which the communities ultimately, just don't get the help that they need. And then we're back where we started at square one.
Yeah. I think the last question I'd like to ask as we get, we're wrapping up is, as a survivor yourself, what do you do to stay grounded in the work? Especially, sharing kids with your abuser and having this kind of ability to let go and be in the present, to be what you needed. Like, how do you stay grounded and take care of yourself in this?
So I know self-care is super important, right? So, ultimately, I definitely pray. That's one of the things that keeps my mind sane, and keeps me straight and narrow. But ultimately, first I have to make sure that I remind myself that I'm being who I needed. This isn't even let me try to get this out. It's not even about my degrees. It's not about my name. Like, you can take all of that away and be Danyette, and I'm still knowing that I'm a survivor and that's how I got here. But then ultimately I have to, I like to read. My girls keep me balanced just because I know that I'm leading them. So, and I have teenagers, right? So every day is a new day in a teenager's home. So really just being around them and vacations pretty much, but, walking and meditating and, those things is kind of what keeps me sane. There's not one thing that does it, truthfully.
Danyette, thank you so much. This is just the first conversation we're having with you. I would love to have you come back to another Coburn Conversations. I think there's so many things that you said that I wanted to take us on a different journey, because I think you're such a wealth of expertise, and your story and your heart is powerful and is changing our city and changing our community and making Indianapolis a safer, more equitable place. So I thank you for your work, and I thank you so much for your time today and letting us really drill down into your expertise of what this looks like in Indianapolis. I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, Fifth Third, who made Coburn Conversations possible this week. And we are so grateful that you came. We will be having more Coburn Conversations. And so if this was really interesting to you, we will have a recording of this that we send out, and stay tuned for information about the next Coburn Conversation.